In the summer of 1994, Jean-Claude Van Damme had a movie open #2 in America, on its way to $100 million worldwide. He was one of the biggest action stars on the planet. 5 years later, his movies were going straight to a shelf at Blockbuster. No premiere, no poster in the lobbies. This is the story of how the muscles from Brussels won the 90s, and then quietly vanished from them. 14 films, worst to best. Let's get into it. 14. Knock Off, 1998. We start at the bottom with a movie about jeans, literally. The plot of Knock Off hinges on counterfeit denim rigged with microscopic bombs. That's the stakes, exploding pants. Here's the part that hurts though. This wasn't some no-name production. Knock Off was directed by Tsui Hark, one of the most influential filmmakers Hong Kong ever produced, a man who reinvented the wuxia epic. Put a pin in that. The story goes that by 1998, the machine around Van Damme was so wobbly that you could hand a genius a camera and still end up with a rickshaw chase, a Rob Schneider sidekick, and a camera bolted to the inside of a shoe. It's not a good movie, but it's a fascinating one. A great director and a fading star, both swinging as hard as they can at a wall that isn't moving. There's a version of Knock Off that's a cult classic. This is the version we actually got. 13. Double Team, 1997. If you're going to make a bad movie, make it this bad. Double Team is insane in the way only a late 90s action picture can be. The cast: Jean-Claude Van Damme, Mickey Rourke, and, I promise you this is real, Dennis Rodman, the Chicago Bull, as a weapons dealer. It ends in the Roman Colosseum. There's a landmine. There's a live tiger. There's a baby. All at once. And again. Look who's directing. Tsui Hark, second time around. This is the other half of a two-film experiment where one of Hong Kong's wildest visual stylists got dropped into the Hollywood machine with Van Damme as his passport. The results are unhinged, occasionally beautiful, and completely out of control. Which, honestly, is a decent description of where the whole operation was heading in 1997. 12. Universal Soldier, The Return, 1999. Okay, this one matters more than it should. In 1999, Van Damme tried to do the smart thing. Go back to the well. Resurrect the franchise that had made him a $100 million star 7 years earlier. A real theatrical release. A real shot. It grossed $11 million. 11. And that number is the hinge of this entire story. The exact moment the theater doors closed. After The Return flopped, Van Damme wouldn't headline another wide theatrical release in America for nearly a decade. Not until 2008. This limp, forgettable sequel is where the biggest run of his life officially ended. The movie itself is thin and joyless, but historically, it's a tombstone. 11. The Quest, 1996. Number 11 is where the ambition sneaks back in. The Quest is Van Damme's directorial debut. He stars, and he sits in the chair. A globe-trotting martial arts tournament picture set in 1925, with Roger Moore no less. James Bond himself. But the story behind The Quest is better than the movie. The screenplay grew out of an old project Van Damme had reportedly written years earlier with his former friend, martial artist Frank Dux, the real-life inspiration for Bloodsport. When The Quest came out, Dux sued. It went all the way to a jury trial in 1998. Dux wanted $900,000. Van Damme won the breach of contract case, but the Writers Guild still handed Dux a story credit. And if you freeze the opening titles, you can see the weirdest credit in the whole decade. One that basically acknowledges two different versions of who wrote what. The movie's fine. The paperwork is a saga. 10. Maximum Risk, 1996. This thing the American debut of Ringo Lam, the Hong Kong director behind City on Fire. The movie that famously inspired a young Quentin Tarantino. So that's John Woo, Tsui Hark, and Ringo Lam, all making their first Western film through the same guy doing the splits. We'll circle that. The movie itself is Van Damme playing twins. Again, hold that thought, because he really could not stop playing twins. One brother dies in the first 10 minutes. The other spends the film uncovering why. It's gritty, it's competent, it's got a genuinely great foot chase through Nice, and it's completely forgotten, which is a shame, because Lam brought a hard, grimy edge that most of Van Damme's American directors never even tried for. 9. Death Warrant, 1990. Here's a piece of trivia that'll reframe this whole movie. Death Warrant, a low-budget prison thriller from the very start of the decade, was written by a broke USC film student who just sold his very first spec script. His name was David S. Goyer. Yeah, that David S. Goyer. The man who would go on to write Blade, and Batman Begins, and The Dark Knight. His career, the guy who helped define the modern comic book blockbuster, starts here, on a Van Damme prison movie originally titled Dusted, bought for a song 6 months after he graduated. The film cost $6 million and made 46. It's lean, it's mean. Van Damme's undercover cop is up against a killer called the Sandman, and it does exactly what it needs to do. It's not ambitious, but knowing that the future architect of The Dark Knight cut his teeth on it, that's the kind of thing that keeps a movie alive. 8. Street Fighter, 1994. Okay, take a breath, because number 8 is the hardest one to talk about, and I want to get the tone right. Street Fighter is, by most measures, not a good movie. It's a live-action cartoon based on a video game. Van Damme plays Colonel Guile with a wandering accent, and critics buried it. And yet, it made nearly $100 million worldwide against a $35 million budget. It's still selling. People love it. But there are two things about this production you need to hold together at the same time. The first is Raul Julia. This was his final film. He was dying of cancer while he made it, so sick that the director had to rework the shoot around his strength. And the story goes that he took the role of the villain, Bison, for one reason. His kids loved the game. He wanted to make them a movie. He passed away that October, weeks before it opened. His performance is the best thing in it, by a mile, and he knew exactly what he was doing. And the second thing, the director, Steven D'Souza, has since said plainly that Van Damme was, in his words, coked out of his mind during the shoot, a habit reportedly running into the thousands of dollars a week. A cast member described him as basically out of control. I'm not telling you that to dunk on the man. Van Damme himself has been open about how deep that got, and how close it came to ending him. I'm telling you, because you can't understand the back half of this decade without it. The peak and the fall were happening on the same set, at the same time. 7. Sudden Death, 1995. Let's lighten it back up, because number 7 is pure, dumb, glorious fun. Sudden Death is Die Hard in a hockey arena. Van Damme is a fire marshal at Game 7 of the Stanley Cup Finals in Pittsburgh. Terrorists have rigged the building, the vice president's in a luxury box, and the bomb goes off if the home team's lead disappears. The action set pieces in this thing are genuinely inventive. There's a fight in the arena kitchen against an assassin dressed as the team mascot that belongs in the Action Hall of Fame. Real Penguins footage, a ticking clock built into the scoreboard. It's a smart, tight, ridiculous machine. It didn't do the numbers people expected, which is part of why it slipped out of the conversation. But drop this on a Saturday afternoon, and it holds up better than half the stuff that outgrossed it. If you've never seen the mascot fight, you're welcome. 6. Nowhere to Run, 1993. Number 6 is the one where Van Damme tried to act, and I mean really act. Nowhere to Run is an action romance. He's an escaped convict who hides out on the farm of a widow, played by Rosanna Arquette, and her 2 kids, defending them from a developer who wants to bulldoze the land. It's Shane. It's a Western in disguise. There's a young Kieran Culkin in it. Here's the wrinkle. The story came through Joe Esteras, at that point one of the highest paid screenwriters in Hollywood, the Basic Instinct guy. And Esteras has since publicly disowned the film, saying his script got taken and, in his words, destroyed, that it lost all its sensitivity. Van Damme, for his part, said the writer promised to fix the script, shook his hand on it, and never did. So what's left is this strange, tender, half-realized thing. A movie reaching for something real that the machinery around it wouldn't allow. And honestly, that reach is exactly why the fans who love it, love it. It's the sound of a guy trying to be more than the splits. 5. Lionheart, 1990. Number 5 is the one that's his. Van Damme didn't just star in Lionheart, he came up with the story. It's the most personal film on this list. He plays a French legionnaire who deserts and treks to Los Angeles to help his dying brother's family, funding it by fighting bare-knuckle in parking garages, drained swimming pools, and back alleys. Under the underground fighting hook, it's a movie about family and obligation, which is what Van Damme actually cared about. You can feel it. The fights are grounded and brutal in a way the polished later films aren't. And there's a sincerity to it that's almost disarming coming from a guy whose whole brand was the roundhouse kick. It's early, it's a little rough, but Lionheart is the closest thing to a mission statement he ever made. This is who he thought he was. Not an action figure, but a fighter with a reason. 4. Double Impact, 1991. Number 4 is the ultimate Van Damme fantasy. Two of him. In Double Impact, he plays twin brothers separated as infants. One a slick Hong Kong gym owner, one a foul-mouthed street brawler, reunited to avenge their murdered parents. The gimmick is the whole appeal, and the split-screen technology lets him fight himself, flirt with himself, and outact himself. And here's the thing people forget. This wasn't a punchline. Double Impact cleared $100 million worldwide. It was a legitimate hit, one of 3 films that pushed Van Damme over that 100 million line in this decade. In 1991, the idea of two Van Dammes was a genuine box office event. It's slick, it's fun, it leans all the way into the movie star charisma, and it kicked off his weird lifelong obsession with playing double roles. An obsession we already saw pop up again in Maximum Risk. If you want peak, uncomplicated, early 90s Van Damme, this is the multiplex version of it. 3. Universal Soldier, 1992. Top 3. Now we're in the real stuff. Universal Soldier is where the concept, the star, and the moment all clicked at once. Van Damme and Dolph Lundgren as dead Vietnam soldiers, reanimated into emotionless super soldiers. And then Van Damme's programming starts to break, and the human underneath claws its way back out. It's a genuinely great sci-fi action hook, and the two of them are perfectly cast. Van Damme the wounded hero, Lundgren the gleeful, unhinged villain. Their first time sharing a screen, and the chemistry is electric. Remember Lundgren? That's a story for another video. The director was Roland Emmerich. This was his Hollywood calling card, the film that launched him towards Stargate, Independence Day, and a decade of blowing up the White House. Emmerich broke through in America on a Van Damme picture. It cost $23 million and made over 100 worldwide. It's tight, it's mean, it's got real ideas about memory and identity buried under the explosions. This is the sound of a career hitting full stride. 2. Hard Target, 1993. And now the payoff. Number 2 is Hard Target, and it is the American directorial debut of John Woo. Read that again. The master of Hong Kong cinema, the man behind The Killer and Hard Boiled, the most influential action director of his generation, made his very first Hollywood film with Jean-Claude Van Damme. It was, in fact, the first movie by an Asian director ever released by a major Hollywood studio. That is not a small thing. That is film history, and Van Damme is standing right in the middle of it. The studio was so nervous about Woo that they hired Sam Raimi, the Evil Dead guy, the future Spider-Man guy, to shadow him on set and take over if he stumbled. He didn't have to. What Woo delivered, even after the studio hacked it down, is pure poetry in slow motion. Doves, dual pistols, a motorcycle sliding under a moving truck, Van Damme punching a snake and then knocking it out. Lance Henriksen and Arnold Vosloo as the villains, hunting homeless veterans for sport in New Orleans. Here's the we of it. For a lot of us, this is the one. This is Van Damme's best movie, full stop. Woo saw him not as a stiff action figure, but as a dancer, and shot him like one. 74 million worldwide, a permanent cult following, and the single most important line on his whole resume. And I already know some of you think it should be at the top of the list. However, there can only be one number 1, and that is Timecop, 1994. Here's the case. Timecop is Van Damme's highest-grossing movie as a leading man, over $100 million worldwide, the third and biggest of his 100 million hits. It was his best-reviewed mainstream picture, and it's the rare Van Damme film built on an idea as strong as its action. A cop in a future where time travel is real, policing crooks who rewrite the past, including the senator, Ron Silver, who's looting history to fund a campaign. There's a genuine tragedy at the center. A dead wife Van Damme keeps trying to reach across time, and it gives him something to play besides pain tolerance. And that famous move, the splits across 2 kitchen counters to dodge a live wire, is right here. Of course it is. But here's why it's number 1. and why it's a little sad. Timecop, in the summer of '94, was the summit, the absolute peak of the mountain. The biggest opening, the best reviews, the widest release of his entire career. He was, for one shining moment, exactly the movie star he'd spent a decade fighting to become. And it was all downhill from there. Everything after this, the Coke, Street Fighter, the flops, the Colosseum Tiger, the $11 million sequel, the shelf at Blockbuster. All of it comes after this high point. Timecop isn't just his best film, it's the last time the whole world agreed he was on top. So that's the decade. 14 movies, and a straight line from the mountaintop of Timecop down to 1999, when Sony took a Van Damme picture called Desert Heat, directed, get this, by John G. Avildsen, the man who made Rocky and the Karate Kid, and sent it straight to DVD without a second thought. The Belgian kid who outdrew Schwarzenegger, releasing to a shelf. But here's where I want to leave it, because this isn't a sad story if you don't tell it as one. Van Damme didn't disappear. He outlasted the whole era that chewed him up. He got clean. He made JCVD in 2008 and reminded everyone he could actually act. He's still here, still working, still ours. The 90s didn't beat him. They just couldn't keep up with everything he was carrying. And along the way, doing the splits, this one guy quietly opened the door for John Woo, Ringo Lam, Tsui Hark, and Roland Emmerich to conquer Hollywood. Not bad for a man Hollywood decided to forget. So tell me down in the comments, Timecop or Hard Target? Because I know some of you are furious right now, and I want to hear it. And what's the one Van Damme movie you'd fight me to move up this list? That's it from the booth. The projector's cooling down, the reel's rewound, and somewhere, a Blockbuster shelf still has his name on it. This has been Victor at Picture Recall. Lights up!